Welcome to today's webinar where we'll discuss BaaS, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how banks and fintechs can continue to innovate while keeping things compliant and so much more. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jeremy Beaudry, and I've served as a senior corporate counsel and chief AML officer at several different financial institutions before joining Unit21. Now I serve as the manager of strategic accounts, where I help traditional financial institutions leverage Unit21 for fraud and AML purposes. And I'll be moderating today, so you're not going to hear that much from me. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Unit21, we provide infrastructure to detect, investigate, and report bad actors through the customer lifecycle. We offer tools and advanced analytics to help organizations fight fraud, money laundering, and other illicit activities. Before we kick things off, we do have a couple of housekeeping reminders. First, this session is being recorded, so if you don't have the ability of checking it out live, we can certainly provide it to you within the next 24 or after 24 hours. And second, this session will also be have a live Q&A portion, which is going to be at the end of our discussion. So please submit any questions you have during this session via the Q&A button at the bottom of our screen. So about today's agenda. Ultimately, why are we here today? We're here to discuss BaaS, the challenges, the enforcement actions, and much more. Specifically, though, we'll be jumping into a few key areas, unpacking the drivers of BaaS growth, interpreting 2023 regulations and the trends onward, preparing for the 2024 regulatory landscape. So please back your BaaS up and let's meet our incredible panelists.
That is a great start.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Sarah Beth, please take it away.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Felix. I have a consulting and advisory firm, and I'm also a bank co-founder up in the state of Vermont. So I bring kind of a different view of things, but I've been in sanctions and AML for going on 23 years this year. This is the only thing I know is sanctions and AML. I don't dabble in other parts of compliance. Over the years, I've worked with a lot of community banks, former AML officer as well. And I also work with global Fintechs, those that are seeking those BaaS relationships, which just a few years ago, we called them Fintech bank partners. And now we have a term for it. But yeah, I have a lot of kind of like the 360 view of both the banking side as well as the Fintech side of things. And that's what I hope to contribute today. Thanks for the invite.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Scholler. I am the BSA officer for Emprise Bank on the embedded side only. I was brought to the bank to help build out the architecture for our emerging business line. I have about 17 years in many different parts of banking, but I've worked in BSA for De Novo Bank, military bank, traditional banks, Fintechs. So I have kind of a unique perspective, and I'm happy to share. Thank you.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name is Dana Lawrence, and my power went out literally minutes before we jumped on here. So I am on my cell phone. I hope it works out. My background is 20 years in financial services, and the last 10 of those years has been spent building out fintechs and neobanks. And starting back in like 2014 or 2015, working directly with the sponsor banks and the regulators to get feedback on the programs. So definitely had a lot of fun building out the fintech side. I worked for a fintech aggregator a couple of years ago that connected fintechs to sponsor banks. And then most recently, I am the senior director of fintech compliance for a wonderful bank called Pacific West Bank in Portland, Oregon. And we have been building out a banking as a service program there over the last year. And really, really proud of what we've accomplished. And yeah, that's about it. Excited to be here today.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Kyle Costello here at Treasury Prime. where I work on our partnerships team, manage the work that we do with a bunch of partners, Unit21 included. For Treasury Prime, actually did some quick math before jumping on here, and it's 13 or 14 years been doing sort of fintech bank, kind of working in this category, starting with the first neobank called First Street Financial back in 2011 or so. And so saw sort of the consumer, neobank side of things. Spent a number of years, about 6 years in total, across a couple of community banks, including one that was doing a lot, over the last few years. Radius Bank, which acquired, but saw it sort of from within the bank, and then over the last few roles I've had have been on the infrastructure side. And so, I think that the theme I'm hearing is lots of sort of unique perspectives, or perspectives informed by sitting at different points in the ecosystem here. And so, excited to join the team.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm really privileged to have the best and brightest minds in the banking and fintech industries with me today, and be able to just sit back and learn more about what they have to say versus me having to discuss my viewpoints. Maybe I'll share a couple here and there throughout the discussion. But now let's get into the panel discussion. So as you can see, BaaS and the activity, the adoption continues to grow. So what do you see as the underlying drivers for this? So Sarah Beth, it'd be great for you to kick it off, and then Sarah, Dana, and Kyle.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing working with global fintechs around the world is that the US is kind of in first or second, depending on the year that we've been looking at, with China going back and forth on where fintechs are easiest to start up. And so I think that is part of the growth that we're seeing. I think that's partly due to our nascent regulatory environment that we have from an AML perspective in the US. I think that's part of the growth. I think part of the BaaS section of that, right? So we know we have a lot of fintech startups. And then how that gets into the BaaS section is, I think a lot of community banks are trying to get rid of their overdraft fees and other things. So they're looking for other avenues of non-interest income. And, they're kind of being told by some of their commercial business folks, or maybe their treasury folks, that BaaS is an easy lift. I think that guidance needs to be couched a little better. But working with a lot of community banks, I'm seeing that is happening quite a bit. So I think that's leading to some of the growth that we're seeing. Also, I think there's really not a lot of focused regulatory pressure on the fintech side, right? So that fintech partner of BaaS, there's not really a lot of focused regulatory orders from an AML and sanctions perspective, but we are seeing that on the bank side. I think 2023 there were 9 orders that were directly related to third-party risk management, and none of those really called out BaaS. None of them used the term fintech at all. So I think because there's not really a lot of, yes, there's some orders having to do with TPRM, but there's nothing really calling out BaaS or fintechs as an issue for banks. So I think a lot of banks are also stepping in and being a big driver of that growth for BaaS banking.
I just wanted to jump in. Oh, sorry to interrupt you, Sarah. I just wanted to jump in because I follow Sarah Beth for regulatory information and regulatory enforcement actions, and on LinkedIn, and you do a wonderful job. And that factoid really shocked me, that across all the enforcement actions for fintech and BaaS and banking as a service sponsor banks, that they don't specifically mention BaaS or fintech. And I think you're right. It's all through the lens of AML and third-party risk management. So I just thought that was super interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Dana.
So from a community bank perspective, there's increased lack of or decreased loyalty to a traditional bank, right? You have tech native populations growing, and true embedded finance, the fintechs are allowing you to bank your identity or bank your profession and keep things in one area where features and layouts are very sticky, right? So if you're already using this app for a lot of what you're doing for your job, then it's very easy to add in finance and have that be a one-stop shop. Or if you consider yourselves, we're seeing more fintechs that are targeting populations like gamers. So if that's really where you see yourself and you see a value in this, what the fintech can bring to you, that's where you will gravitate versus a traditional bank account. And for people who are younger and younger, it is easier to switch over an entire banking relationship versus someone who has been entrenched and with the same bank for quite some time. And then on the banking side, again, from a traditional bank or community bank perspective, our bank has 3 generations of family owned processes and relationships, and we have that part down. What we don't have down necessarily is the new technology. So we can bring that bank infrastructure and our tried and true methods of operation, and then add in a partner with that technology and grow our business that way. So that's where we see drivers in my world.
Awesome.
For me, I mean, oh, sorry, Dana, after you.
Oh, no, go ahead.
For me, the drivers of BaaS growth are, it's really how attractive is this compared to how attractive are the alternatives. Historically, there's been a few drivers of growth in banking. Banks, at least the ones I've been involved with, can buy other banks, right? Sort of M&A as a driver of growth. They can build new branches. That's been, a longstanding driver of growth. So, place one in the right spot and attract new deposits, make new loans, things like that. Both of those have had, some changes. I think, headwinds, you maybe want to call them. For M&A, right? We've seen there was a period over the last, maybe earlier than the last year or so that we saw increased valuations. Banks, I heard things like, hey, I'd buy a bank, but I can't get one at a price that I like, sort of thing. And then that's morphed, I think, into some lots of regulatory scrutiny in the wake of SVB and other collapse, right? That's, I think, making folks a little less open or less willing to go look too hard at the next M&A opportunity. And we've seen that bear out in data, right? We've seen quite a drastic decrease over the last few years in M&A activity. Same with branches, right? We've not seen lots of growth there. We've seen the opposite. That's a well-known and well-reported story. And the other driver, if you zoom way out of banking and look at how to consumer services companies grow, direct marketing and acquisition and sort of that's been a big driver. And outside of the top handful of banks, right, Capital One and others are famously really good at this. Acquiring customers in sort of a cost-effective way. That's not true for your long tail, middle and long tail of community banks. They just don't have the scale, don't have the know-how. And I've worked on those teams, right? And so I sort of feel this firsthand. And so BaaS is there's lots of demand. Nobody's arguing about that changing. And I think banks are looking around and they're saying, hey, this is emerging as one of the better of my available options. And I think that's really the biggest driver, at least from my perspective.
And Dana?
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute my iPhone. No, I appreciate and agree with the sentiments of the rest of the group. I think that a lot of banks are trying to figure out how to deal with a compressed net interest margin, which is something I've learned recently in banking, trying to figure out how to make money as a bank simply. And exploring different investment opportunities or business lines as a new source of revenue is something that most banks are probably contemplating. Another benefit, potentially a BaaS, I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the risks, but a potential benefit is to be able to expand the good work of your bank charter into other communities that you're potentially not serving. The bank that I work for is a benefit corporation for good, which is pretty unique in banking. We value people, planet, and profit, a triple bottom line. So we actually can extend our bank charter and the work we're doing by partnering with Fintechs who, share similar values. And I think Sarah's scholar said, bank your identity. So there are communities of people, and they might not be, everyone who gathers at the local, community hall or the coffee shop, but it's people who have some aspect of their identity or their values that is similar, and they have a digital community, so to speak. And then my final point on that is I definitely see a lot of building continuing to happen on the fintech side. Maybe it's a little bit different from what we saw in 2022 and before, when maybe it felt like the funding was more available. But I definitely see a lot of building in fintech, particularly with a flavor of artificial intelligence and figuring out how to harness the technology to create solutions that we haven't seen before. So still a lot of stuff going on. And that's it for me.
Yeah. With all of the comments that were made, I think ultimately, from my perspective too, is that banks or traditional banks, the larger players, have not always been very tech centric. They've a lot of the times they're relying on you just physically walking into a branch and haven't had to deal with, well, if a bunch of friends go out to dinner and one person picks up the tab and ultimately they wake up the next morning and they're like, well, I don't want to pay for all this. How am I going to get 7 other people to pay me? Well, they weren't really thinking about that. Then that's when the fintech started emerging and saying, well, I'll send you money via Venmo, Cash App, and so on. So thanks everybody for that discussion. But then what happens with growth in a perfect situation, everything's wonderful and hunky-dory. However, we live in reality, and with growth comes some challenges. So the way that we're wanting to interpret 2023's regulation trends and how they're going to impact us in 2024 and beyond, we want to know more about how y'all think about this, and what were some of the actions that were brought up in the enforcement actions. But I also want to know whether or not, through reading all these, and we already kind of touched on it with Sarah Beth and Dana mentioning them, but were there any similarities that we can help the folks that are watching that have not read all the enforcement actions? So Sarah, I'd like to start off with you.
Sure. So certainly the theme that I kept seeing come up is the financial institution is the regulated entity, not the fintech, not your third party. It comes back to you. So no matter what happens, it's the financial institution that is responsible for what's going on. Issues found at any point along a partnership are going to come back and be the responsibility of that financial institution. And certainly within this, the fintechs are the innovators. They're the ones constantly thinking of the new plans and the new things that they can do. And the bank needs to be there to be guardrails in the best of cases, maybe a leash in the worst of cases, and pull them back and say, all right, let's innovate, but let's innovate within this box of regulations and truly make that partnership work for both sides. I can tell you from my perspective, this has meant that Emprise has chosen as part of our architecture to take on primary monitoring as a bank and then do quality assurance over what our partners are doing. So we have an understanding of what they're doing, but we also are assured that without trying to duplicate everything, our regulatory responsibilities are being met. Um, the only other thing that I would say in here is that the board needs to be 100% not only aware, but involved and invested. Everything fintech is going to be long term. You can't just dip your toe in and then jump right back out. And your board and your exec team needs to be committed to hiring the right people, building out the programs that are necessary or the processes that are necessary for that oversight.
Awesome. Great points. And Dana?
I love what Sarah said, and I definitely echo the point around board involvement being critical. That is feedback we've heard from our regulators, because they not only need to be presented the information, but also formally approve certain things, because everyone needs skin in the game when you are introducing such a new risk area to your institution. Couple points that I had, and the one thing I put in my notes, like in all caps letters, and I think this is like the tattoo we can get on our forehead, the slogan we can get on our coffee mugs, but it's the bank can outsource activities, but still owns all the regulatory risk. Like, you cannot outsource the risk. And that's something I hear across a lot of people. And how I think about that is, when I work with my BaaS partner and my Fintechs, as the sponsor bank, I'm the one who's regulated. I'm the one who's talking to the regulators and subject to all this scrutiny. So I view the different parties in that value chain as an extension of my team. I need to understand what they're doing. I need to monitor the quality of that work, and I need to provide feedback if needed. So it's not just a one-sided thing. Like, I also need the Fintechs to help provide new, the Fintech, I need the Fintech also to help this program be successful. So I really think of it as more of a partnership in something that goes both ways. I ask that the Fintech understand and be open to my feedback. And also, I'm open to, their feedback. I want to stay informed on what they're doing, what their product roadmap is, so that we can effectively manage the risk. One other thing that I think caught some folks off guard was maybe not understanding all of the risks associated with the Fintechs. From a bank that maybe is more in person in nature, and then partnering with a technology that is maybe offering, it's all digital, and maybe is offering different components. So I think understanding exactly what the risks are, whether you want to get a GRC tool or do a good old fashioned risk assessment, really mapping out everything that the Fintech is doing. What type of risk does that present to your bank, and how are you going to deal with it? So those were my top points.
Yeah, thanks for those. I think when you combine both Sarah and Dana, there are aspects that we could really learn, that regional banks getting into this space, and you had your compliance team dealing with just your traditional stuff. But when you go into fintech, it's totally different areas. So you need to hire appropriately. You don't want to just hire the same folks that are just like, oh, I'm a community banker. I've seen some AML trends. Good to go. Kyle, what about you?
Yeah, I think the team set on a lot of what I'd have had to say as well. The note I had was the use of third parties, right? It's phrased, there's this joint guidance, right? The FFIEC joint guidance. I'm sure we have a link to that somewhere, but the use of third parties does not diminish the bank's obligation, right? Is sort of the verbatim that sticks in my head. And so, a bunch of clarity. If there was ever any doubt, as to who's holding the bag, it's the bank, right? I think, the other piece that that stuck out to me a bit was, a lot of frequency of, they call it different things, but KYC, CDD, BSA, AML, like a lot of that coming up too. There's clarity around roles and responsibilities, but then there's some clarity around obligations and expectations around visibility into things like this, right? We work with a bunch of banks, and some have said, hey, we've had customers that have been running KYC on their own. That's great, but then they need to do it with us, right? And so sort of that visibility is loud and clear, I think, throughout the guide.
And finally, Sarah, Beth.
I mean, what I'm going to say is really nothing new, because everyone has already said it. But I think the thing, for me, because my area is sanctions and AML, is that a lot of times I'm seeing the term compliance, the general term compliance, thrown around by bank boards, by bank executives, by different groups and advisors. And they're like, oh yeah, we are in compliance. We being the like the fintech, and it's like, all right, being in compliance with CFPB requirements does not equal AML and sanctions compliance, and that's where I feel like it's best if we can the term compliance to cover AML and sanctions. Sanctions and AML is a whole animal of its own, and there is full transference of AML and sanctions risk from the unregulated or quasi-regulated fintech to their bank partner, full stop. And I know everyone else has said that, but that is my hill I will die on. I'm trying to get FinCEN to remove these 4 loopholes going back to 2003 that allow the majority of fintechs to not to have an exemption under the MSB rule. And so I really hope that will change at some point. I don't know if it will. I do a lot of work on the Hill. I'm hoping that it will, because it's unfair that banks have to be the de facto regulator when the federal government could just remove these 4 loopholes, and then we could be like our sister nations where they regulate their fintechs like a bank, or in the UK, they regulate them as a PSP. And here in the US, we go, oh, you have no AML and sanctions regulations. I wonder why we're number 1 or number 2 in the world for fintech startups. So with that being said, a lot of banks don't know that we have such a nascent regulatory framework that then puts them to answer for something that their fintech said, oh no, well, we definitely monitor. Having worked on that side, when they say they monitor, they're monitoring basically for fraud and operational losses because they don't want to lose their shorts, which is not the same thing as sanctions and AML. It's certainly not the same criminal, certainly not the same monitoring pattern that's needed, fraud versus AML. So I saw a lot of those. If you were to read between the lines on several of those consent orders that talked about the deficiencies for third party, working with several banks that never rose to the level of having a consent order, but they have informal MOUs, MRAs, MRIAs, things like that. So they aren't public. But between the public consent orders and the ones I've seen that are not public, I will say that while the FFIEC BSA AML manual clearly states that banks are not the de facto regulator, and that's the term that they use in the manual under the NBFI chapter, it states they're not the de facto regulator. However, they are in fact the regulator. I mean, that is what we are seeing. Banks are actually the regulator because our federal government is not regulating. So one of the things I always ask is, before a bank goes down this path of banking BaaS, just to kind of make sure that they won't fall into this rhythm that we've seen, especially in 2023, is have you ever thought about banking a foreign financial institution? And if they look at me like I would never bank a foreign financial institution, then they're not ready for BaaS. That's probably a good litmus test for any bank who's on this webinar today and thinking about it. If your board would say, no, I would never bank a foreign financial institution, then you may want to reconsider all of the risks that you will get in a BaaS type of environment, regardless of whether or not it's a direct or indirect BaaS relationship. You're still dealing with an unregulated party from an AML, well, from an AML point of view. They do have sanctions responsibility. So just from the AML point of view.
I wanted to offer just an idea for potential people in the space when confronted with exactly what Sarah Beth just said. Sometimes there is debate over who is regulated, who is not regulated. I'm not regulated, so I don't have to do it. I've heard that a lot. And, you know, we've kind of seen how that works. And my point of view is I work at a bank, and at the end of the day, I'm partnered with a fintech. And at the end of the day, that bank account is at my bank. They're a customer of the fintech, but the deposit agreement is also with my bank. So I am personally, my bank is responsible for all activities associated with that account, preventing, managing, detecting consumer harm, illicit financial crime, everything. So that's what I come back to if you ever find yourself in that debate. And that's what I wanted to add. So go ahead.
Yep. I appreciate that. And when you're looking at a lot of the enforcement actions, of course, remind everybody, please follow everybody here, but I certainly follow Sarah Beth for the enforcement actions footnotes that she provides. And enforcement actions are not going to magically just go away, because ultimately things continue to change. There's always going to be a fintech that is going to think of a new product and it's going to trigger or ring alarms on the regulator side. So I think that ultimately they're unavoidable. It's just how harsh are they? And another thing to add is that the fintech related to the bank, they are the customer. So the fintech doesn't want to mess things up, because imagine if the bank was like, all right, see ya, go find another one. Well, if one bank has already passed on them, the likelihood that they're going to set up something else gets slimmer and slimmer. So ultimately, is you want to have a really good process. You want to have AML processes already in place, so that, you know, when you are presenting yourself like the bachelor bachelorette style, you want to be the person that's getting the bank rose, right? So for our next question is, when you look at the types of issues that end up coming about BaaS and the fintech relationship themselves, what do you think would be how a bank and a fintech can kind of balance it out, making sure that things are you're going to continue to accelerate, whether it's you're getting retail customers or business customers, but how is a bank and even a fintech able to do that dance, being able to have that really great partnership, but ultimately be able to grow? So I'd love Dana to start that off with answering that question.
Sure. I am like very passionate about this topic, and I guess we all are, since we're spending our time having this conversation. I think that this is the secret sauce that is going to demonstrate who's going to be doing BaaS for the next 10 years and who's going to decide it is not for them. What I think the secret sauce is having a true partnership. And I think partnership is not something you can necessarily demand in a contract. It's more of the idea of, we are both coming to the table to collaborate. I want my fintechs to be successful. I want them to be able to innovate. I'm going to fight and advocate for them to have good solutions. In return, I need them to understand that they're part of a cohort where if something happens to the reputation of the bank I work at, it's going to impact the entire ecosystem. If we are not consistently having productive educational conversations with regulators, taking the time to go through whatever they need to get comfortable, it's not going to work for any of us. So And when you said who wants the or who gets the bank's rose, that really cracks me up, Jeremy. I think that there are many different types of company cultures. There's many different people out there in the world. There's going to be fintechs that will work better with different banks, bank partners that will be more suitable for other fintechs. There's different ways to structure your program. I'm seeing some comments in the chat that say one bank partner will let me do my own AML monitoring, one won't. Do we need a compliance officer? Those are a lot of things you're going to have to think through. However, if both parties truly come to the table with the spirit of, we actually really need to work together so we're all successful, that I believe is going to be the secret sauce. And again, it's not something that you can get from a checklist. It's more of the kind of the fiber and the values and the mission of your organization, and ongoing communication, ongoing collaboration. When problems happen, how you deal with it. And then I guess my final point was bringing your regulators along with you. I know a lot of folks, complain about the regulatory process, and I'm a longtime auditor myself, and I will, admit at times it can be very uncomfortable / brutal, and it's an important part and of the ecosystem, and they're trying to ensure safety. So do as much as you can to bring them along with you and provide education. But I don't know, those are my top points. I'll pass it over to someone else.
Awesome. Kyle?
Thanks.
Yeah, it's got to be a balance, right? It can't be, the safest thing to do is nothing, right? But nobody wants to do that. And you can't, grow at all costs, right? It's got to be this balancing act between growth and compliance. For me, so I mentioned earlier that I spent a couple of years at a bank early on in doing this, actually, treasury primes for a sponsor bank called Radius Bank. When I got there, I one of the things that really struck me as a value was really thinking through, is this a partner? Is this a client? But can we partner in a way that we really trust them and feel like we can go advocate internally at the bank on their behalf, but also know that they're out there kind of representing Radius by extension well. And that was really a firm cut on evaluating opportunities. Is can we really feel confident in this team's ability to not just execute well, not just grow in the ways that they think they'll grow, right? But have good judgment. And good judgment's everything from, do you know how to talk about yourselves? Are you a bank? You're not a bank, right? Like you provide banking, right? These simple things that I think are we can look to as sort of early indicators. But are these folks that know the rules, and are these folks that will follow the rules? Is really what it comes down to. And I think of the sort of the two-way versus one-way door metaphor is, it's a partnership that you're getting into for the long haul, right? These contracts can be long. You've got, at the end of doing all the work that you do together, you've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers, and so it's not a thing that you can sort of pick up and be casual about, right? You really have to look at this customer of yours in the eye and sort of understand, am I willing to get in bed with these folks kind of long term, right? Because it does feel like that kind of relationship. I think the other point that comes to mind is we sort of frame these as a tension, right? Growth and scale and compliance, and I think that's felt true, right? It's probably every compliance team I've met could always use a few more folks on the team to help do this stuff. But I think we're starting to see technology help, right? I feel like every couple of weeks I see a new company come up that is interested in helping banks and fintechs understand the rules and operate by the rules. I've seen a lot of like large language model driven, generative AI sort of compliance. I've seen it in sort of observability. did folks see the, deposit agreement? I've seen it around, onboarding diligence. Here's the rules for a customer. They're in good standing. They have their, their financials. They've got, all these things that show us that they are who they say they are, and they can pay, and they know what they're doing, and all this stuff, right? That can take, historically, it can take months to get through at the bank, right? And of course, the bank, needs to have everything fully buttoned up. But I think, we're starting to see technology as an accelerator, right? So you can, continue to follow all the rules, continue to grow like you need to, but do so in a way that, that doesn't require as deep a, manual spot check or, the same level of kind of manual oversight. And so, I think these things can start to work together versus kind of being in tension with one another.
Thanks. And Sarah Beth, how do you look at 2024, even going into 2025's landscape with fintechs and banks? How can they improve it? You've already kind of addressed some of the things of if a bank is considering going into the BaaS servicing, but specifically, how can BaaS or banks, the sponsor banks and the fintechs improve the relationship?
Well, I would say from the bank side, the board has to be comfortable and has to know in clear writing that they will be in the red before they're in the black. If they do it correctly, they will be in the red before they're in the black. If your board, if their satiety point is set at, I want to make money day one, Q1 of banking, of being in BaaS, then you have not communicated to them the nascent regulatory environment that you're in, and you have not communicated the threats that are posed to your institution. So your board must be, now it is not easy. It is uncomfortable. But I will tell you, the banks that have done this right, have done it for the long term, like each of the panelists have said, this is a long-term thing. This is just not a hit it and quit it. This is a long-term type of approach. And in order to get there, like with anything that we do in our life, you have to be in the red before you get in the black. So I think that has to be the main messaging from the bank side. From the fintech side, some areas where I think we could use some improvement. If you are a fintech, which I see there's a whole bunch of questions in there from fintechs, the best thing that you can do is put on the mind of a criminal and figure out, if I was the next Jeffrey Epstein, or if I was the next El Chapo, how would I exploit my fintech products to move money? That is the best thing you can lead with. If you want to get a second date with a bank that gets it, then you must lead with that. That has to be tip of the spear. Hey, these are our threats. Risk assessments are great, but risk assessments, if they don't incorporate threats, and by threats I mean how a criminal will use your rails to move dirty money, that is a threat. How will that look like? Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but what you need to do is be able to communicate those underlying threats. From the bank side, you should also be doing a threat assessment. And like Dana talked about, you come to the table as a partnership. Risk assessments are good. Threat assessments are way better. So I would from the bank side, I would also have your team go, all right, this is Fintech XYZ. This is what their products do. Let me go look at them. Let me see what Reddit says about this Fintech. If they've been around and they're moving to your bank, let me go see what, what kind of the open source intelligence is out there regarding this Fintech, regarding their payment processes, their products that they have. How would somebody move money? And you have the bank do it, you have the fintech bring it, and then you together go, oh, wow, okay, so given these threats, this is what we're going to need. And then that really helps to give some hope to the board that you won't be in the red forever, right? That you'll be in the red for a little bit. And then this is the point where we will get in the black from the bank side. So that's probably the best advice, free advice, which is good as, as what you paid for it. But that's the best free advice that I can give, is lead with threat assessments. Risk assessments are good, but risks without evaluating threats and vulnerabilities are really just kind of, surface level talk. So really get into the threats, put on that mind of a criminal. One more thing. From the VC side, I've been working with a lot of VC firms that are trying to just blow up, right, these unicorn kind of fintechs. That's great. I'm all for innovation. But one of the things, and there was actually, I believe, 2 orders, one under the SEC, one under OFAC last year. I posted about both of them, where VC firms were not fully vetting that the fintech was doing what they were supposed to be doing from a sanctions and from an AML perspective. So if you are a VC firm or you're working with a VC firm and you aren't asking your fintech, hey, tell me what you're doing for sanctions, tell me what you're doing for AML compliance. If you aren't asking those questions, then you might have quite a sizable investment blow up in your face, or you might lose some money because now you have to pay a penalty. So that's another thing.
And finally, Sarah.
Sure. So we've had Know Your Customer, we've had Know Your Business. We now have Know Your Partner. You need to fully understand what your partner's doing. And that fintech needs to present themselves to you as well. They need to make themselves understood and come with solution-oriented ideas and not just stay back and be passive. The financial institutions should make sure, to Sarah Beth's point, that there is not only enough of an understanding from that fintech partner to have a risk assessment or a threat assessment. They need to know themselves, because that might uncover things that the financial institution could never touch or could never solve for, and now needs to be monitored at a heavier level. Those gap analysis are critical to having a strong partnership that will last. It doesn't take the place of conducting your own assessment of that partner. The operational oversight needs to be at the financial institution level and not at anybody else's. Again, coming back to that FI is the one that's regulated. And every compliance person's favorite phrase, trust but verify. Like we want to trust that this is going to be good, but we need to verify that it will be for our continued success. And then those partnerships go beyond just the financial institution and fintech or BaaS partner. Foster that relationship with your regulators as well. Bring them along, show them what you're doing, train them so they can understand better and not just push that off into, we don't know much about it, so we don't think you're doing enough. Certainly, if you have a good relationship with them, talk to them about your partnerships once that MSA is signed, but before it goes public. You never want your regulators to find out something from just general press release that they didn't find out from you. And talk them through your method of oversight for your plans. And that is a relationship as well. Don't hesitate to ask your regulators what pitfalls they are seeing out in the world, especially in the fintech space, because they will tell you, and it gives you a good heads up for what to be ready for your next exam or your next conversation with them. And those things will very much help to set you on the right path going forward.
Awesome. I didn't expect this much relationship advice being in a compliance webinar. So I think the AML profession can also lend itself to relationship dating advice. So a couple of things. I know that we have a Q&A and we only have 9 more minutes, so I'm just going to breeze through a few closing thoughts. And you really need to read your regulatory enforcement actions or follow people that will give you the cliff notes, apply learning lessons to your compliance program. The growth in AML should not be treated as polar opposite goals. They can be together, and I think that we went through some discussion points today of how to harmonize that between the sponsor bank and the fintech. It's a delicate balance, but it can certainly be done. You want your business relationship to last a lot longer than your typical bachelor engagements. That's something that I noticed while listening. And then even things that seem to be perfect are not always perfect. Regulators and examiners will always find something to report. So ultimately, you need to make sure that you're ready for those. And just because your sponsor bank or your bank is going through an enforcement action doesn't mean it's the end all be all. It's always a learning experience. So thanks everybody for joining me for this portion. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to continue this conversation, we would love to hear from you, whether it's the specific speakers and panel that we had today or Unit21. And just a simple plug for Unit21 is we have several different ways to address the challenges we've discussed, such as our org switcher and parent-child feature to treat fintech separately instead of a gobbled mess by running bespoke rules and workflows to drive efficiencies and reduce false positives or alerts. Now for the Q&A section, we only have about 7 minutes, so I'm gonna ask that the panelists go in lightning round style. I know that some of these questions might be a little bit loaded, but question one is Sarah Beth, what arrangements / advice do you have between the bank and fintech sharing the cost of compliance based on roles responsibility between the parties?
So as you delve into certain pieces, this is absolutely a great idea. Does the bank have a robust training program? Can we issue separate licenses to our individual fintechs so that we can make sure that the training is up to snuff, and share the costs there, making it much cheaper for those fintech partners, and much more secure for the bank? There are ways to do some of these items. But
yeah,
that's
I know
my quick and dirty.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And ultimately, acting as if you're the bank, if you're the fintech, having a proper compliance officer, having a team is going to get you that much faster to get greenlit, and then also probably reduce your compliance costs with maybe charges that the sponsor bank might provide you. I'm going to skip to another question for Kyle. What is the reasonable amount of time needed to stand up a BaaS program?
Yeah, so we've talked about it, not being something you should get into lightly, and I think that shows in some of the timing. I think I'm tempted to answer from a technical perspective of, how long does it take to hook things up, but I'm also mindful that there's a bunch of other work involved, right? There's, it's probably 12 to 16 weeks to do the actual nuts and bolts, making everything work, at least, for a treasury prime bank. But there's a bunch of broader stuff, right? There's operationalizing this new business line that you just wrote all these policies for. Hopefully you've got the policies, right? If not, you've got to start there. How do we operationalize that? How do we hook up all the adjacent things like KYC, like transaction monitoring, BSA, ML compliance? Your banking as a service platform doesn't necessarily provide those, right? And so the testing, the configuration for those, it could take 4 to 6 months all told. Fastest might be 4, right? Assuming you're doing everything I just described in parallel. But even after that, you've got to go, meet your first fintech and go through their diligence and, feel like this is somebody you want to go start a long-term relationship with. And so it's an investment, that's time, that's capital, attention.
Cool. And question number 3 is, and this is, I think, for Sarah Beth and Dana. It's how would you sell your boss that there must be a compliance culture when they only see compliance as a cost center? But I also think it's your boss and the board, because ultimately it's probably the board that is making that decision. It will get relayed down to the boss in a waterfall style. But how do you sell compliance to the boss and your board? So let's start off with Dana.
It's a constant public relations effort. If you want to be in a compliance leadership role, it is part of your job description. You need to have a meaningful seat at the table. on the executive team and impact within the board. There's so many ways you can try and influence this. However, if your company, if their risk appetite exceeds your risk appetite and what you know to be correct and to keep you out of trouble, I would just measure how much time you're willing to spend versus simply moving on. There are organizations where you can spend years of your life trying to advocate for something and it will never happen. So finding an organization that values compliance out of the gate and is open to your feedback is honestly the tough truth. But sometimes it's, you just simply need to leave.
I
Sure.
love that. I was going to say that, so I'm so glad you said it. You said it much more eloquently than I would have. I would have been like, really? After all this time, like, just get out, just go to a place where you don't have to fight. Because one of the signs of an ineffective authority bucket, if you will, which is fully entitled to you, in every single consent order we saw last year, every single one where there was an AML issue had an authority problem with it. So if you are in an institution and they say, oh, you have authority to XYZ, but you still can't hire an extra person, that is a sign that you do not have effective authority. You have the illusion of authority. There are plenty of other places that will give you real authority to make decisions. The only thing I would add to what Dana said is to use penalties as part of your quick and dirty communication to the board. Last week, I did a webinar with the BaaS Association, which if you don't follow them, I would follow them as well. The BaaS Association, one of the stats I led with was over $4 billion in penalties in 2023 between AML and sanctions. And those are just the straight up penalties, the check you have to send to the Fed or to OFAC or to the Treasury. That does not account for what we typically see 3 to 5x behind the scenes of remediation costs. So telling the board, hey, if we don't get this right, this is what's happening. And if you are a community bank, about 70% of the penalties we saw last year were for community banks, 10 billion and under in assets. And boards like quick and dirty information, they like colors. So just make it super clear, like, hey, if we don't do it right, this is what's happening to everyone else. So that's the only thing I would add to what Dana said.
Well, I certainly really appreciate everybody's comments from the panel today. I know we have tons more questions that are in the lobby, but unfortunately we won't be able to answer them today. So we can't solve all of the world's problems in an hour, but ultimately you have everybody's name. Sure that everybody is on LinkedIn, which I know that they are. And so please reach out to them directly if you have a burning question for them. But I would sincerely like to thank every single one of you for joining me today, but also thanking our panel for joining me and educating us on how to look at the BaaS and FinTech relationships and how to improve it and challenges and so on. So again, thank you all for joining us today on your, what is it, Wednesday today? Wednesday. And hope to see you again at another webinar. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.